Usually when we talk about a company's safety protocols, there's this expectation of, like, absolute structural integrity.
Right, like a baseline standard.
Exactly. Think of a massive manufacturing plant. You walk in, the compliance manual is, it's the size of a phone book.
Oh, yeah.
The high visibility gear is perfectly aligned on the wall, and the floor manager points to a yellow line and says, that is the standard. Do not cross it. I mean, it's engineered to be foolproof.
Well, it's designed to be a binary system.
A binary system.
Yeah, the rules are either followed to the letter or the line shuts down.
Hmm.
There's no middle ground when you're dealing with heavy machinery.
Right, but then you actually spend a week on that factory floor, and the reality is completely different.
Oh, completely.
Like, the manual's propping up a wobbly desk. We're looking at a compliance landscape that is entirely conditional. It's a company that only strictly follows safety protocols when the corporate auditors are, physically in the building.
When they're walking the floor with clipboards.
Exactly. The moment the auditors pack up their briefcases and drive out of the parking lot, it's immediately back to cutting corners. The workers remove the safety guards from the machines to speed up production. The manager just looks the other way to hit a quota.
Which is the absolute definition of fair weather loyalty to a system.
Fair weather loyalty, yeah.
And, well, the framework we are looking at today takes that exact flaw in human psychology, that conditional, reactive compliance, and applies it not just to a factory floor, but to the survival and collapse of entire civilizations.
Which is wild to think about on that scale.
It is. We are dissecting a foundational text today, Surah Ar-Rum, specifically verses 33 through 39, but we are looking at it entirely through the lens of political economy, sociology, and systems engineering.
So just to be clear for everyone listening, we're stripping away the usual religious sentimentality here.
Entirely. When you read this through the systemic framework of thinkers like Ghulam Ahmed Parvez, you aren't reading a theological sermon about being pious or showing gratitude.
Right, it's not about saying your prayers.
No, not at all. You are reading a highly sophisticated, brutally rational survival manual for human society. I mean, it's an economic blueprint.
Let's start with that factory floor mentality then, because verse 33 describes a scenario that feels almost uncomfortably familiar.
It really does.
It observes that when sudden distress hits a population, so maybe it's a famine, a massive natural disaster, or a total economic crash, people immediately call upon the foundational laws.
They panic.
Yeah, they appeal to the ultimate authority, to God, to nature, to the overarching design law of the universe, essentially begging for the system to save them.
Because they've run out of options.
Right. But the moment the pressure lifts, the second the crisis is averted, a group of them immediately break the rules again. The text says they associate partners, which, in a structural context, means they start operating outside the unified system.
They set up their own side deals.
Exactly, their own extractive subroutines.
And that phrase, associate partners, is usually framed as a moral failing. Traditional interpretations say, look at how ungrateful humanity is. God saves them from the storm, and a week later they are worshiping something else or forgetting their prayers.
The classic guilt trip.
Right. But the sociological analysis we are applying here reframes that entirely. This is a hard, empirical data point about conditional alignment.
Wait, walk me through that. How is associating partners an empirical data point?
Well, think about the auditor analogy again. If your employees only wear their hard hats and safety goggles when the inspector is standing there with a clipboard, their alignment with the safety protocols is not real.
It's just a performance.
Exactly. It is purely reactive. They aren't following the rules because they understand the structural necessity of safety. They are following them to avoid an immediate penalty.
So when the distress hits, like when the building is on fire, everyone suddenly respects the fire codes.
Yes. But reactive alignment produces absolutely zero durable systems.
I mean, that makes sense.
You cannot build a sustainable civilization, a resilient economy, or a functioning society on a population that only adheres to the productive order when they are under severe duress.
Okay, I see the logic, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Isn't human nature inherently, fundamentally self-interested?
That's the common argument, yeah.
Like, from a purely evolutionary standpoint, if survival is pretty much guaranteed in a moment of prosperity, why should we expect humans to maintain strict, rigid, structural alignment?
You mean, why not bend the rules?
Yeah. If the sun is shining and the harvest is good, why wouldn't someone try to hack the system to hoard a little extra for themselves? It just seems like practical biology to me.
You're hitting on the exact friction point that defines human history. You're asking why we can't just hack the system when things are comfortable.
Right.
The analysis of this text introduces the concept of dini qayyim. The translation of that is an immutable, self-sustaining, structurally sound system of life. The core argument is that true, durable prosperity requires absolute structural alignment, and it uses the metaphor of celestial mechanics to prove the point.
Celestial mechanics. You mean like planetary orbits and gravity?
Precisely. Look at the solar system. The planets don't take a day off from the laws of orbital mechanics just because it's a Tuesday and there are no asteroids threatening them.
That would be bad.
Very bad. The sun doesn't decide to alter its nuclear fusion process because it wants to hoard a little extra hydrogen for the weekend.
Right, it doesn't get greedy.
No. The universe operates on an immutable, perfectly balanced design law. Everything in the physical universe is bound by these laws, and because they are bound, there is no collision, no chaos, no systemic friction.
It's a closed loop that works perfectly.
Exactly. And the text argues that for human society to avoid violent self-destruction, it has to emulate that level of absolute, unyielding adherence to a unified systemic law. The alignment has to be structural, not conditional.
But planets don't have a choice. Mars can't suddenly decide it wants an elliptical orbit that intersects with Earth. Humans have free will.
We do.
We can choose to ignore the economic and social gravity. We can choose to build the machine without the safety guard.
And that is exactly where the engineering of our own crises begins. Because we have choice, we have the unique capacity to introduce fatal bugs into our own operating system.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
When the overarching system provides generous conditions, abundant rain, a booming economy, technological breakthroughs, humans tend to feel independent of the design law.
They get arrogant.
Yes. They look at the surplus and think, I don't need the unified system anymore. I am the master of my own universe.
Which brings us to what actually happens when we try to overwrite the core system with our own self-serving rules.
It's never pretty.
Looking at the analysis of verses 33 through 37, it points out the sheer fickleness of human behavior during prosperity. The moment the crisis is gone, the hoarding begins, the factionalism begins, the extraction begins.
To really understand the mechanics of this extraction, we have to look at a radical linguistic reframing from the source material. It completely changes how you read these ancient texts.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the reframing?
The traditional word used to describe this behavior is kufr. Now, if you look at a conventional translation, kufr is almost always defined as disbelief or ungratefulness.
Setting up a moral binary.
Exactly. The righteous believer versus the wicked disbeliever.
Right, the classic theological framework. You didn't say thank you to the divine for your bountiful harvest, so you are exhibiting kufra. You are an ungrateful sinner.
But the linguistic deep dive in our sources strips all that theological baggage away. The literal Arabic root of the word kufra means to conceal or to cover up.
To cover up.
Yeah. Picture a farmer physically taking a seed and covering it with dark soil. That is the physical action of kufr.
Okay.
Now, take that literal meaning and apply it to a socio-economic context. In a systemic framework, kufr is not about what you believe in your heart or whether you say a prayer of thanks.
It's an action.
It is a physical economic action. It means hoarding.
Oh, wow. So it's the physical covering up of resources.
Exactly. It means taking the surplus resources, the wealth, the capital that the system generated for universal societal nourishment, and covering them up.
Hiding them away.
You hide them. You lock them away in your private vaults, in offshore accounts, in monopolized real estate so that the rest of the society cannot access them. You are concealing the lifeblood of the system.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because if we look at the baseline of the system nature, the Earth, the laws of physics, it is incredibly abundant.
Generous by design.
Light, water, the fertility of the soil, the heat of the sun, the oxygen in the air, all of these foundational inputs are provided at zero cost. It's a mathematically generous baseline.
Right.
And yet, this text forces us to look at a massive, glaring paradox. If the overarching design of the system is so generous, why does half the world sleep hungry? Why is systemic poverty a constant?
Well, if you rely on the old theological lens, you usually end up with a deeply cynical answer.
Like what?
You end up with leaders or clerics saying, well, it must be God's will. God is testing the poor with starvation to measure their patience.
Wow. Yeah, you hear that a lot.
It's common, but that is a terrible, intellectually lazy answer, and the structural analysis of this text aggressively rejects it.
Because the text provides a totally different answer.
Yet.
It uses the phrase, bima quadamat aydihim,
Yes.
which translates to what their own hands have sent forth. God, or nature, does not ration the sunlight.
Yeah.
The universe doesn't have a supply chain problem. Human bottlenecks create the rationing.
This is the law of requital, cause and effect in the socio-economic sphere. The system provides the raw materials.
Right.
Any resulting scarcity, famine, or systemic failure is not a divine punishment falling from the sky. It is a self-generated cycle.
A doom loop.
Basically, yeah. When people in power use periods of prosperity to hoard and extract, when they commit this economic coup, they are literally hollowing out the productive base of the society that generated their wealth in the first place.
Wait, hold on. Let me make sure I'm mapping this correctly with a modern example.
Go for it.
If a Category 5 hurricane wipes out a coastal town, people intuitively call that an act of God. You can't control the wind speed or the barometric pressure.
No, you can't.
But this text is arguing that the vulnerability of the town, the fact that the poorest citizens were forced to live in substandard housing in the floodplain, that's human-made.
Absolutely.
The fact that the seawalls weren't funded because the tax base was hoarded by a wealthy elite. The fact that relief supplies were hoarded and sold at a premium after the storm. That disaster is an act of human engineering.
It's completely structural.
You can't blame the hurricane for the death toll when the social structure was already stripped to the studs.
That is a perfect translation of the concept. The wind is simply the universal law in motion. The devastation, the disproportionate suffering is bima quadamat aydihim, what your own hands have built.
Right.
You engineered a brittle, top-heavy, hollowed-out system, and the natural stress test of the universe exposed it. The text is demanding that humanity stop blaming the overarching natural system for the failures of our own corrupt subroutines.
And there's a profound psychological toll to this kind of hoarding, isn't there? Because when a system is engineered to extract wealth and block access to resources, it does something fundamental to the human mind.
It breaks people.
Yeah. The source material breaks down two specific Arabic terms that, again, are almost universally translated as mythological entities.
Yeah.
Iblis and Shaitan.
Right, the typical demons.
But looking at them through this systems engineering lens, they take on a terrifyingly practical meaning.
For centuries, those terms have been treated as interchangeable names for a supernatural devil whispering in your ear. But from a sociological and linguistic standpoint, they represent two distinct, observable phases of societal collapse.
Two phases.
The root of the word iblis means profound despair. It describes a state of utter hopelessness, a psychological paralysis that occurs when every single avenue for survival or progress seems permanently blocked.
Okay, so that's the first phase. What about Shaitan?
Shaitan, on the other hand, comes from a root meaning aggressive, burning rebellion, or destructive distancing.
So it's not two different monsters, it's a pipeline. It's a progression of human behavior.
Yes. The source uses a brutally effective analogy here. Imagine you trap a cat in a room.
Okay.
As long as there is even a tiny crack in a window, a sliver of an exit under the door, the cat will frantically try to get out. It has hope.
It's trying to solve the problem.
Right. It operates within the parameters of trying to find a solution.
Right.
But if you completely seal that room, if you brick over the window, seal the door, and the cat realizes there is absolutely mathematically no way out,
It panics.
it doesn't just lie down and accept its fate. The despair mutates. The cat becomes violently, aggressively destructive. It attacks everything in the room, including you.
Wow. So, translating this back to our political economy. When an economic system creates total despair, when the elite commits so much economic coup for so much hoarding that the working class sees absolutely no path to survival.
They enter the state of iblis.
Total despair.
Yeah.
When there is no upward mobility, when wages stagnate for decades while inflation soars, when they can't feed their kids no matter how many hours they work, they are in that sealed room.
And human populations don't stay in despair forever. The despair always mutates.
It inevitably mutates into Shaitan,
Yeah.
violent systemic rebellion.
Exactly. When you block all legitimate avenues of survival, destructive behavior is not a moral failing of the poor. It is not that the working class suddenly lost their morals.
It's structural.
It is the mathematically predictable psychological result of a blocked system. The text is issuing a structural warning to the ruling class.
Which is?
Your hoarding creates the despair, and that despair creates the violent friction that will eventually burn your hoarded wealth to the ground. It is the law of requital, cause and effect.
You cannot trap the cat and then act shocked when it scratches you.
Bingo.
So if hoarding inevitably breeds that violent rebellion, that Shaitan phase we just talked about, how do you release the pressure valve? Because Clearly, just telling billionaires to be nicer or relying on random acts of kindness isn't preventing societal collapse.
No, it's not. And this brings us to what I think is the most controversial, paradigm-shifting argument in this entire framework. It completely upends how modern society views philanthropy.
We are about to explode the charity is virtue myth.
Oh, yes.
Let's look at verse 38. The translation usually reads something like, "Give the near kin their right, and the traveler and the one in need." The Arabic word used for the person in need is miskin,
Right.
and the critical word used for what you give them is hack.
When I was reviewing the notes on this, the use of the word hack stopped me in my tracks. Hack literally translates to a legitimate structural claim, an undeniable legal right, or a fundamental truth.
Not a gift.
No. The text explicitly, intentionally bypasses any word related to charity, pity, voluntary benevolence, or alms.
And the source material goes incredibly hard against the entire modern nonprofit philanthropic complex.
It rips it apart.
It argues fiercely that from a systems design perspective, charity is fundamentally toxic. It argues that charity creates a psychological superiority complex in the giver. They feel pride, they feel like magnanimous saviors.
They get to play the hero.
Exactly. And simultaneously, it creates a crushing inferiority complex in the receiver. They feel humiliated. They feel like beggars subsisting on the scraps of the elite.
If we put on our sociologist hats, the Quranic economy being described here is built entirely on acknowledged claims, not emotional generosity.
Right.
If you have surplus wealth, which is defined as wealth beyond your immediate needs to function and live securely, the system dictates that this surplus isn't actually yours to gift as a favor.
Wait, really? It's not mine.
Legally, structurally, it belongs to the person whose economic engine has stalled.
The stalled engine. I want to spend some time on that because the definition of miskin is brilliant.
It's very specific.
Yeah, it's usually just lazily translated as the poor. But the linguistic root is related to sukun, which means stationary, stopped, at a standstill.
Like an engine that died.
Exactly. A miskin is someone whose economic motion has stalled. Maybe a factory worker's plant shut down and moved overseas. Maybe a farmer's crop was wiped out by a flood. Maybe someone got a chronic illness and can't work.
Their gears have stopped turning.
They have lost their forward momentum.
So, under this framework, when you transfer resources to the miskin, you are not doing a good deed that earns you a bronze plaque on a hospital wing.
No tax write-off gala for you.
Nope. You're simply routing the system's fuel back to an engine that has stalled so the overarching societal machine can keep moving forward.
Okay, I had to push back here, and I'm going to push back hard. Because I can feel everyone listening getting defensive, and honestly, I'm getting a little defensive myself.
I get it. It challenges everything we're taught.
Right. If I donate $10,000 to a local food bank, or I fund a scholarship for an underprivileged kid, this framework says I shouldn't feel good about myself. I shouldn't feel that warm glow of giving.
No.
Look at modern philanthropy. Look at the Giving Pledge, where billionaires promise to give away half their wealth. Isn't that emotional reward, that societal praise, exactly what motivates human giving in the first place?
It is, yeah.
So if you take away the emotional payoff, why don't people just stop giving entirely?
I understand the defense, but you have to realize that is a deeply modern, heavily capitalist framing of human motivation.
Okay, how so?
The systemic analysis of the text counters that relying on emotional surpluses to fix structural deficits is catastrophic systems design.
Why is it catastrophic?
Think about it from an engineering perspective. Emotions are incredibly volatile. What if you wake up cranky?
I mean, I do that a lot.
Right. What if the stock market dips and the billionaire feels financially anxious? Do the stalled engines of society just remain stalled because the wealthy aren't in the mood to be generous today? What happens when a crisis isn't highly publicized or photogenic enough to pull on the heartstrings of donors?
It's the conditional alignment again. Relying on charity is exactly like the factory worker only wearing the hard hat when the auditor's there. It's fair-weather loyalty to the survival of the society.
Exactly. A truly stable system cannot rely on the volatile moods, the PR campaigns, or the ego-stroking of its participants. Fulfilling the hack, the right of the stalled engine to receive fuel should be as clinical, as routine, and as expected as paying your electric utility bill.
I love that analogy.
When you pay your water bill, you don't expect a brass band, a gala dinner in your honor, and a thank you letter from the mayor.
That would be weird.
It would. You pay it because it's an operational requirement for civilization to function. You want water to flow through the pipes. The text is arguing that redistributing surplus is not a favor you are granting the poor. It is the rent you pay for the privilege of living in a functional, non-rebellious society.
That is a brutal but incredibly clarifying way to look at it.
Yeah.
You are returning what is owed to maintain the structural integrity of the system. You are preventing the cat from being trapped in the room.
Precisely.
So if we've established that surplus must circulate as a structural right to prevent collapse, how do we actually do it? Because the text directly contrasts this necessary circulation with the ultimate engine of wealth concentration. Let's look at verse 39.
This is where the mathematical reality of the system becomes uncompromising. Verse 39 sets up a stark contrast.
That's the contrast.
On one side, it describes wealth that is given in Riba, which it defines as giving so that it increases within other people's wealth.
Okay.
On the other side, it describes wealth given as zakat, which is given seeking systemic alignment or God's face in the metaphorical language of the text. The verse states plainly that Riba does not increase systemically, but zakat acts as a massive multiplier.
We need to do a thorough systemic translation of these terms because they carry so much historical and religious baggage. Usually, riba is just translated as interest or usury, and zakat is translated as a 2.5% religious tax or alms.
Right, but the source completely redefines them based on their root actions and their economic consequences.
Let's start with riba.
If we want to understand Riba, we have to stop thinking of it just as a bank charging 5% on a mortgage.
Okay, what is it then?
In this socio-economic framework, Riba is defined as any risk-free, extractive, closed-loop transaction that concentrates wealth without producing any actual tangible value for the system.
So parasitic capital.
Exactly. It is capital extracting more capital simply by virtue of existing.
And conversely, zakat is not a flat percentage tax that you pay once a year to feel pious. The linguistic root of zakat means nourishment, purification, and development.
Which is very different from a tax.
Right. It represents redistributive investment that multiplies the productive capacity of the entire society.
To visualize the mechanics of how this works, the text uses a brilliant metaphor. It refers to those who practice this systemic circulation as mufalun, which translates to successful farmers or cultivators.
Let's walk through that farmer metaphor because it makes the math intuitive. Imagine a farmer. God, or nature, provides the physical seed.
And the soil.
Yes. The system provides the fertile soil, the rain, the sunlight, and the biological laws of germination. So the overarching system provides 99% of the baseline requirements for life.
A huge baseline.
But that seed won't grow if it's just sitting on a marble floor in a bank vault. The farmer, the mufli, must step in and do the labor. They have to till the soil, plant the seed at the right depth, protect it from pests, and irrigate it.
And what is the mathematical result when human effort perfectly aligns with the natural law of germination?
It grows.
But a single seed doesn't just return one single seed. It returns a stalk with 100 seeds on it. It multiplies exponentially.
Wow.
This is the structural mechanism of zakat in an economy. When you take your surplus and invest it into the nourishment of the society, when you fund public infrastructure, when you capitalize a stalled worker so they can build a business, when you build schools, you are fertilizing the economic soil.
You're doing the labor.
Yes. The return to the society isn't just one-to-one. It is a multiplied harvest that benefits the entire ecosystem. The pie gets bigger for everyone.
And riba is the exact opposite behavior. Riba is taking that same seed, locking it in a titanium vault, and demanding that the vault magically produce 2 seeds next year.
Which is physically impossible.
Right. Or worse, it's finding a desperate person whose engine has stalled, giving them the seed so they don't starve today, and saying, you can eat this seed now, but next year you owe me 2 seeds.
Regardless of the conditions.
Exactly. Regardless of whether it rains, regardless of whether your crop fails, regardless of your physical health.
Which brings up a very common modern counterargument. Modern banking theory, neoclassical economics, argues that interest is the necessary cost of circulating money.
They say it incentivizes lending, right?
They argue it prices risk, it accounts for inflation, and without it, capital freezes. So how does this text distinguish between a healthy, productive business investment that yields a return and a toxic, extractive riba transaction?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Let's say I invest $50,000 to help my friend open a bakery, and we agree I get a percentage of the profits.
Mm-hmm.
Am I committing riba? Am I destroying the system?
According to the systemic analysis of the source, the dividing line is shared risk and real-world value creation.
Shared risk.
If you invest in your friend's bakery, you are sharing the risk of the enterprise. If a fire burns the bakery down, or if the bread tastes terrible and nobody buys it, you lose your capital.
So my skin is in the game.
Yes, you are invested in the outcome and the productivity of the venture. You are doing the labor of the farmer. You only win if the society gets a productive new bakery.
But with Riba,
With Riba, you are completely decoupled from the risk and the reality of the labor. You give capital solely to hijack the fruits of another person's labor, demanding a guaranteed return regardless of the systemic conditions.
you aren't providing societal nourishment.
No, you are attaching a parasite to a host.
Let's actually look at the math of why it's parasitic. Because it's not just a moral judgment, it's a mathematical certainty that it crashes.
Oh, the math is undeniable.
If you have a closed system, let's say an island economy, with exactly 100 gold coins in circulation, I have all 100 coins.
Okay, you're the monopoly.
I'm the monopoly.
Right.
I lend them to the rest of the islanders, but I demand 5% risk-free interest at the end of the year. I want 105 coins back.
And there lies the fatal flaw. There are only 100 coins on the island. The extra 5 coins literally do not exist.
Right. So to pay me back, the islanders either have to cannibalize each other's wealth, bankrupting some of their neighbors to get the coins, or they have to come back to me and borrow more money just to pay the interest on the first loan.
Driving them deeper into debt.
Exactly. In a closed loop where capital demands exponential growth without creating commensurate real-world value, eventually the mathematical debt outpaces the total physical wealth of the system. It has to collapse.
This is exactly why the text treats this specific form of extraction not just as a sin or a bad business practice, but as a literal declaration of war against the socio-economic order.
A declaration of war. That is intense.
But it is accurate. If someone is deploying a mathematical mechanism that guarantees the eventual collapse of your society through total wealth concentration, that is an act of hostility. It is systemic sabotage.
So this brings us to a massive contradiction.
Which one?
If the math of this system is so brutally clear, if circulating wealth through Zucket and Hack creates a thriving, multiplied society, and extracting it through Riba mathematically guarantees collapse, despair, and violent rebellion, why do humans actively sabotage it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Why do we keep choosing the path of collapse? If the safety protocols are written right there on the wall, why do we keep taking the guards off the machines?
This is where we examine the psychology of the elite. We're looking at how human beings actively subvert the universal system to protect their hoarding while still trying to look like the good guys.
The source material has a fantastic chilling phrase for this. It says the problem begins when humans try to write the book of nature themselves, rather than just reading it.
The universal laws, gravity, thermodynamics, the economic law of requital, these constitute the book of nature. We can read them, we can understand them, and we can align our societies with them.
But we can't rewrite them.
We cannot rewrite them. However, people in power constantly invent their own artificial laws, their own convoluted legal and religious frameworks to justify their hoarding. They try to overwrite the core system.
And it creates friction.
Massive destructive friction. When self-made extractive laws clash with the immutable laws of nature, the text calls this friction facade, which translates to corruption, decay, and systemic breakdown.
The most darkly comedic and, frankly, infuriating part of the source material is how it details exactly how this facade is generated. It talks about the Book of Hayal.
Yes, the book of loopholes.
Hayal means tricks, evasions, or loopholes. The source outlines historical examples of religious clerics and legal scholars who were tasked with upholding the ban on riba.
But they didn't do that.
No. They invented absurd, complex loopholes so the elite could keep extracting wealth without technically breaking the religious law.
It is the ultimate manifestation of conditional alignment. The auditor is in the building, so let's put a fake safety sticker over the broken machine and hope he doesn't look too closely.
Let me break down the specific math of one of these loopholes from the text because it's
right.
staggering in its hypocrisy. Let's say a wealthy lender wants to lend a desperate person 10 rupees, but wants 12 rupees back in a year.
Okay.
The core systemic law says, no, that is riba. That is a risk-free extraction of 2 rupees. It produces no value, and it destroys the system.
Clear as day.
So the lender goes to the cleric and says, how do I get my 2 rupees of profit without going to hell?
And what does the Book of Loopholes advise them to do?
It advises a shadow play, a piece of financial theater. The lender takes a random object off his desk, say a piece of cloth.
A piece of cloth.
He sells this cloth to the desperate borrower for 12 rupees. But the borrower doesn't have any money, so the sale is done on credit to be paid in 1 year.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Then, the very next second, the lender buys that exact same piece of cloth back from the borrower for 10 rupees in cold, hard cash.
Let's trace the actual economic reality of what just happened, stripping away the theater.
The reality is,
Mm.
the borrower walks away with 10 rupees in cash today, which is what he originally needed to survive. But he now legally owes the lender 12 rupees in a year.
And the piece of cloth?
The piece of cloth never left the lender's desk. It was just a prop. It served no economic function.
Unbelievable.
But the cleric signs the parchment and says, "Behold, this is not an oppressive loan. This is trade. Trade is permitted by the system."
They rebrand it.
Yes. In fact, because you went out of your way to find a legal workaround to respect the letter of the law, God will actually reward you for your piety.
It's breathtaking. They engineer a system of pure, unadulterated extraction, and then use the language of the divine law to bless it.
It is weaponized sentimentality. And you see modern equivalents of this everywhere. Think about complex financial derivatives in the 2008 housing crash.
Oh, absolutely.
Or massive corporations using double Irish with Dutch sandwich tax loopholes to hide billions of dollars. They pay armies of lawyers to ensure that what they're doing is technically legal under the laws they themselves helped write.
Completely ignoring the fact that it is mathematically hollowing out the society.
Exactly. This highlights how religious, moral, or legal sentimentality is frequently co-opted to protect elite capital. By focusing entirely on the letter of their own self-made convoluted laws, they blind themselves to the systemic intent of the universal law.
The universal law didn't ban Riba because God arbitrarily hates the number 12. It banned it because that specific mechanic of wealth concentration destroys the social fabric.
Right.
But by using the loophole, the elite convinced the masses to accept exploitative poverty as legal and therefore God's will, or just the free market at work.
Which brings us right back to the psychology of Iblis. Remember, Iblis, that state of total despair.
The trapped cat.
The source points out that Iblis's core flaw wasn't just that he disobeyed the structural system. It was that when he was called out on it, he blamed the system itself. He said to God, "You led me astray. You created these conditions. It's your fault."
That is the ultimate terminal danger of these loopholes. When the elite use the Book of Hayal to justify their extraction, they teach the desperate, stalled miskeen to look at their starvation and say, well, the clerics say this transaction was legal under God's law, or the economists say this is just the natural business cycle, so my poverty must be an unavoidable decree.
It shifts the blame.
It shifts the blame for an engineering failure, a human-designed bottleneck, onto the universe itself. It prevents the society from diagnosing the actual problem, the hoarding.
Because if you think the system itself is what's making you starve, you won't try to fix the human bottleneck. You'll just give up.
You'll stay in despair.
This has been an incredibly heavy, profound analysis. Let's pull all these threads together as we wrap up. We started by looking at Surah Ar-Rum, verses 33 through 39, not as a religious sermon, but as a compact, brutally logical political economy.
If we synthesize the core takeaway, it's this. There is a permanent principle at work here, and there are changing variables.
Okay, what's a permanent principle?
The permanent principle is that durable prosperity, the kind that doesn't collapse into violent rebellion, relies absolutely on systemic redistribution. It relies on the fulfillment of structural rights, the hack, ensuring that the stalled engines of society are refueled as a matter of operational necessity.
It's the utility bill.
Yes, it cannot rely on crisis-driven generosity, fair-weather loyalty, or the emotional whims of charity.
That is the immutable law, the celestial mechanics of society.
Right. But while that permanent law of circulation remains immutable, the changing variables are the tools of extraction.
How we extract changes.
The friction we introduce changes era by era. In the ancient world, it was literal usury, burying gold, and hoarding grain in silos. Today, the tools are vastly more sophisticated.
Like what?
It might be high-frequency algorithmic rent extraction, private equity firms gutting functional local companies for parts, monopoly pricing on life-saving pharmaceuticals, or supply chain bottlenecks engineered specifically for artificial scarcity.
The tools evolve. The loopholes get a slicker coat of paint. Maybe they use synthetic collateralized debt obligations instead of a piece of cloth on a desk. But the structural consequence is always mathematically the exact same.
Concentration of wealth without circulation leads to systemic failure.
The cat gets trapped in the room. The exits are sealed. The despair of Iblis turns into the violent rebellion of Shaitan, and the system burns.
It is cause and effect. Bima qadamat aydihim.
What your own hands have built. So if you're listening to this, next time you look at a global crisis, whether it's a grinding economic stagnation in your country, a massive supply chain collapse, or social unrest breaking out in a capital city, ask yourself a question.
A really hard question.
Are we blaming the immutable laws of nature for an engineering failure of our own design? Are we calling it an act of God, or just the way the global economy works, to avoid looking at the hoarding happening right in front of us?
That's the real test.
Because if your prosperity, or the prosperity of the system you live in, is built on a closed loop of extraction, if it relies on loopholes to bypass the fundamental rights of the stalled engines in your society, what exactly is your plan when the rest of the system finally stops producing?
That is the ultimate stress test for any civilization.
It is. The auditor is always watching, whether we wear the hard hats or not, and the math always balances eventually.